أعزائي المشاهدين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. نرحب بكم في حلقة جديدة من برنامج الحد الأدنى. هذه حلقة تتمتع بعمق إنساني خاص، وكذلك جرح تاريخي أصاب جسد القارة الأفريقية جراء الاستعمار الماضي. ولكن في 18 من يوليو 1918 أطل إلى الدنيا بعينيه الواسعتين الوثابتين طفل يبتسم أمام تحديات الدنيا، حيث ولد وسط القهر والدماء، ولكن شعلة الأمل لم تنطفئ في عينيه، وهو يحمل شعلة الحرية من أجل شعبه ومن أجل الإنسانية. ذلك الطفل هو نيلسون مانديلا، الذي نحتفي هذه الأيام بمناسبة مرور 100 عام من تاريخ ميلاده. في مذكراته مسيرة طويلة نحو الحرية، حكى نيلسون مانديلا قصة الكفاح الطويل والدماء والدموع وبصمته التاريخية التي وضعها في سجن روبن في جنوب أفريقيا، وكان ينظر إلى ابتسامات البيض في شوارع جوهانسبرغ والمدن في جنوب أفريقيا، وكذلك ابتسامة الزعماء في العالم الصفراء التي كانت تسخر من قوة الإرادة والعزيمة التي كان يتمتع بها شعب جنوب أفريقيا. وكذلك نيلسون مانديلا الذي حقق ليس فقط حرية شعبه في جنوب أفريقيا، ولكن رسم في وجه الكون ابتسامة وعلامة النصر فوق سماء الإنسانية. ونحن نحتفي بهذه الذكرى العاطرة والكريمة. يسرنا أن نستضيف من داخل الاستديو سيد السفير فرانسيس مولدي، وهو سفير جنوب أفريقيا في الخرطوم، والذي تسنم مقاليد عمله في أبريل 2015. Mr. Francis Moloy, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khalid, and thank you very much for welcoming me into your homes.
Thank you very much. لكن قبل أن ندلف إلى تفاصيل الحوار البرنامج، أعزائي المشاهدين تفضلوا أن نشاهد معا مقطع يحكي في أقل من دقيقتين مسيرة الكفاح والأمل والدموع والحرية لنيلسون مانديلا منذ الطفولة وسجن جزيرة روبن حتى شعلة الحرية التي أضاء بها سماء العالم.
This is the hour the world has been waiting for.
Nelson Mandela began his walk to freedom, raising a clenched fist, unweakened by more than a quarter of a century in jail.
18 July 2018 marks 100 years since the birth of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. A life worth remembering, celebrating, and honoring. A life devoted to building his vision of freedom and equality for all.
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
He gave his all to the making of a just society, but there is still much to be done.
I have cherished the ideal of democratic society with equal opportunity for all. That is an ideal, he said, for which I am prepared to die.
The Nelson Mandela Foundation seeks to honor and advance his legacy through a series of activities and events under the banner of his centenary year. To do so, we have created a new brand property and brand identity. We have developed an iconic mark that is true to the life and times of the man himself. The imagery is emotive, positive, and strong, yet simple and practical. local yet global, a reflection of the past and an inspiration for the future. The symbolism and associated artwork captures elements of Mandela's life in their most raw and purest form, combining the struggle, the incarceration, and the liberation into a commemoration of his 100 years. The unique typeface is inspired by and recreated from Mandela's personal letters. The word mark provides the necessary detail of his name and the centenary year, and then closes off with a slogan and call to action intended to motivate the world at large to find the Madiba in themselves and to be the legacy. Finally, the anchor of the mark recognizes the foundation as the custodian of his life and times and a committed facilitator of his legacy. This new brand identity for the Nelson Mandela Centenary is as bold and strong as he was, and will serve well to promote what he asked of us, to help live his dream. And so it is that we are very proud to share this with you.
It is in your hands to make of our world a better one for all. It is in your hands to make a difference.
Mr. Francis Molloy, welcome back again after we have seen and watched together the introductory film that summarizes the Long Walk for Freedom, the famous memoir of our leader, Nelson Mandela. Maybe the first question, which makes sense about why you are celebrating the century of life of Nelson Mandela those days.
Well, Nelson Mandela is very close to the hearts not only of South Africans, but of many peoples across the world. And I know that Nelson Mandela is very close to the hearts of the peoples here in Sudan. And given the role that Nelson Mandela played in our own liberation struggle, and in the liberation struggle of our continent, and the values that he espoused, and the significance of his life and of his ideas, and the way he approached life and ran his own business. I think Nelson Mandela has been seen to be a very significant figure, and therefore our government has decided that since he would have been 100 years this year, we should celebrate that momentous occasion in a very special way. First of all, with the view of seeing how we can resurrect his values, seeing how we can remind ourselves of the values that he espoused. And that is the most important, I guess, reason why the centenary of Nelson Mandela has to be celebrated in a very special way.
Has South Africa passed that apartheid legacy and history, or the wound is still very fresh and bad memory is still hanging around?
Well, I think it is important to realize that, or to note that when we achieved our freedom in 1994, that was after almost 3.5 centuries of colonialism, racism, and apartheid. So we are talking of a very, very long legacy of oppression, of denial of rights, of the lack of democracy and lack of tolerance, and the poverty that resulted out of these very oppressive systems of government. So when we achieved our freedom in 1994, I think many people say this was a political miracle. Well, it wasn't quite a political miracle because a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into that. Then surely we achieved our political liberation, but there's a lot that we still need to do going forward. We still have challenges of poverty in South Africa, challenges of inequality, and the struggle to continue to build democracy, to deepen democracy, to build a caring society, to build an economy that will include all those who were previously marginalized by the discriminatory laws of apartheid. So in 1994, we did not achieve everything that we wanted. I think if you ask me, Mr. Khalid, 1994 was the beginning of a long struggle going forward to address the legacies of colonialism, racism, and apartheid. So to answer your question directly, there is still a lot more that we need to do. But the important thing is that we have created the conditions on the ground to provide us with an opportunity to achieve what we have set out to achieve.
Thank you very much for that. I think would like to focus on the living legacy of Nelson Mandela, his values, tolerance, peace. And one of the dimensions that I always admire about his leadership, that sometimes he swam against the current of call to use violence to achieve freedom. We have seen that in America before, between the civil rights movement over there.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to talk about Mandela's personality, the special characteristic of his leadership, because he always, even during this long time of prison, you know, he couldn't lose faith in himself and his people. And based on his personality, what do you think motivated him, you know, to keep that faith even in the darkest time of his history?
Well, I guess Mandela was a freedom fighter. Mm-hmm. And I watched one of his interviews very recently, and they were asking him about that incident in court when they were all convicted mm-hmm. and sentenced to life imprisonment. In this interview, Nelson Mandela, he was asked, but when you said you have cherished an ideal of a free and democratic and equal society where everybody has equal opportunities, when you said this is an ideal that you wish to live for and achieve, but if needs be, this is an ideal that you are prepared to die for. Mm-hmm. Why, the interviewer asked Mandela, why did you say that? Were you not afraid? And Nelson Mandela said, it's not that he was not afraid of, it was just bravado, as it were. But he said that he was convinced that the kind of crimes that they were convicted for, under South African law at the time, they required a death sentence. Mm-hmm. And the case had the state had a very strong case against them. And when they were convicted, all of them were sure that they were going to hang and to die. And in that interview, Nelson Mandela says, when you are a freedom fighter, you must ensure that you leave a legacy that will continue to inspire other generations, because the struggle for freedom is much bigger than any individual. So taking a cue from that, I would imagine that Nelson Mandela was just an ordinary man, but who had conviction of his views, given the struggle for freedom that he was leading. Not only him, but with all his other comrades, the African National Congress, and the support of the international community. So I think that would have given him some form of inspiration to continue to march forward.
But I think part of his legacy was a unifying factor, because even when he was in prison, there was a lot of division within his people and the party. But what is very important about it, that he remained to be a strong believer on his people and their inspiration and their will to achieve full freedom. Most of historical leaders are sometimes, they lose faith on their people. But Nelson Mandela never did that.
Yes, I think given the long history of his organization, the African National Congress, which was established way back in 1912, and the African National Congress had very excellent leaders in the form of, I'm just mentioning one, Albert Luthuli, who was the first African to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And given the kind of leaders that had led the African National Congress for many years, I think they would have inspired any freedom fighter to continue to believe in the justice of the cause for freedom. And I think even Mandela himself, given his own background as a young man from the Tembu Royal House, having been schooled in leadership, having been part and parcel of great leaders of his own people in the Eastern Cape, and given his close relationship with the great leaders of the African National Congress, I think he felt inspired to continue to work for the liberation of the people of South Africa. And as you correctly point out, the ANC being the leader of the freedom struggle at the time ensured that the struggle is focused on liberating the people of South Africa. And I guess given the justice of that struggle and the support that South Africans received all over the world, and Mandela talks about this all the time, that our struggle was a just struggle, and our struggle was supported by the international community. And certainly if you have that kind of a struggle and you have the people committed to achieve their freedom, it doesn't make the life a little bit easier, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. But with the commitment, you are able to carry the day.
I think one of the dimensions of his legacy that he extended his hand to greet the oppressor and the white regime over there, and even the clerk at that time. Most of the people, African people, because they are so emotional and suffered from that oppression, they couldn't imagine that Mandela can forgive the oppressor.
You know, the apartheid government at the time had labeled him, his comrades, and the ANC as terrorists.
Yes.
And this is the perception that the white community, I guess, and some of the people had about him, that he was a terrorist. He was not interested in peace. He wanted to overthrow the government through force of arms and all that. So the image of Mandela that was created by the apartheid government was very, very bad and very, very negative. However, Mandela had denied throughout his incarceration that he was a violent man. Some of his most famous words during the treason trial, during the Rivonia trial where he was convicted, he stated there that he has always been against white domination. He has always been against black domination. He was never wedded to the idea of
coexistence.
He was for coexistence, and he was never wedded to the idea that white people have to be chased into the sea or they must leave South Africa. In one of the short film that we watched, he says there way back that as far as he was concerned, there was plenty of room in South Africa for everyone who was there, black, white, South Africans of Indian descent, and everybody, and there was no need for the kind of policies
but people
that we
in South
had at the
Africa
time.
was so traumatized that even this injury in their mind and their memory cannot fade away. But there are a lot of experience in Africa that they chased away some white people that they lived there for a long time. But But even as I know from history that Nelson Mandela himself struggled within his own people themselves to convince them that, violence is not our way. Chasing out whites is not our way. But coexistence and peaceful settlement is the way. How hard was that actually?
Well, I think it's not easy.
Yes.
It is not easy at all because, as you correctly point out, the pain remains in the heart. The suffering is still there. The poverty is still there. And we know that a great deal of this poverty was engineered by the kind of policies that were there to discriminate against others. So the pain is certainly in there. And I'm sure Mandela himself would have had a tremendous amount of pain in his heart because of that. I mean, he stayed in prison
It's a big cause.
Exactly, for 27 years. He wasn't able to be with his family. He wasn't able to live a normal life like many other South Africans who went through the same route. But one of the things that he says on the day when he was released, he was asked the same question, but don't you feel that, this is not easy. What are you going to do? He said he realized when he was leaving the prison that if he left that prison with bitterness and anger in his heart, he will still be an unfree man even outside prison. So he had to...
This is very beautiful.
Absolutely. He had to leave behind his anger because he would have been even more oppressed. So I think Nelson Mandela, Allah has been very good to South Africa, I think, because he has given us the person of Nelson Mandela who could provide by example what it means to forgive and to start anew. I think if we did not have a Nelson Mandela, maybe the situation would have been different.
Absolutely.
Because it becomes very difficult, Mr. Khalid, I think, for me to continue to hold a grudge, to continue to want revenge when I see a person like Nelson Mandela, who himself has sacrificed so much. And I'll be looking at myself and I say, if he is able to think differently, despite the pain, but he can think differently, I think I also need to do something. I'll give you a very good example of how he was able to lead us in simple ways to live in harmony with everyone. In 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. And obviously our rugby national team was completely white with the exception of one black player, Chester Williams. And we were still a very divided country. Black was there, white was here, and it was still, apartheid was still fresh in our minds. And when we hosted the Rugby World Cup, a lot of black people did not feel happy about supporting this all-white team playing against the world. But it was Mandela who garnered support for this team. Because for him, he said, this team...
It's not about color.
Exactly. This team plays for South Africa. And when this team plays there and it is victorious, all of us are victorious. And he wanted he supported that national team, and he rallied all of us, and we all became the supporters of this great team. And when we won the World Cup, it was like all of South Africa has won. And this is how we still feel up until today, with the victory in the Rugby World Cup in 1995, which we repeated in 2007. So through sport, we were able to be organized, to be united, and to look at ourselves as South Africans, not as black as white, but as South Africans. And the person who really
do you think Mandela created new identity for South Africa?
I think Nelson Mandela gave us the idea of what it could be if we were to commit to building a united South Africa. And he did not do so by preaching to us. He did
By example,
so.
he led by example.
He led by example.
Yes.
And therefore, it becomes very difficult for an ordinary South African to think that I can go through this way when he was able to provide leadership in that way.
Before we go to break, we have a final question. That do you give credit for the last white government before the freedom, that because they made the compromise to end this apartheid and go for election?
Well, there are many factors that brought about the events that culminated in the elections and the final election of President Mandela and so on and so forth. And some people, the political analysts, look at the following factors, for instance, that you'll recall that towards the end of the 1980s, the international community underwent dramatic changes with the collapse of the Soviet Union,
yes.
the breakups and the end of the Cold War. And we in Southern Africa were the terrain, as it were, of the rivalry between the two superpowers at the time, the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And I'm sure you will recall that many of the liberation movements there in South Africa, including the ANC, were supported very much by the Soviet Union
Correct.
and other Eastern European countries. I'm talking now Cold War.
Cold War, yeah.
And when that happened, when the Soviet Union broke up, it obviously changed the dynamics down there in Southern Africa. And many of these analysts say that was one of the critical factors that catapulted South
yes.
Africa to that.
Created new momentum.
It created a new momentum. The second thing was that with the independence of Namibia mm-hmm. from South Africa, under the support of the United Nations and so forth, it became very difficult to have a situation where you could have only South Africa still under apartheid when all the other countries in the region,
they got their independence.
They got their independence. The third thing was that there was a war the war of aggression that South Africa was waging in Angola at the time.
Yes.
And there were lots of Cuban forces who were fighting on the side of the Angolan government at that time against UNITA. The Cuban forces working closely with the armed wing of the African National Congress, Umkhonto weSizwe at the time, and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia in Angola. And many of those white boys who were soldiers in the erstwhile South African Defense Force, many of their bodies were coming back in body bags. And that was something very painful to the government to see their young boys coming back in body bags. The fifth factor that was critical in bringing about 1994 was the complete isolation of apartheid at the time. Mm-hmm. Apartheid was isolated at all levels, politically, economically, and otherwise. And it was beginning to bite very, very seriously. The economy was taking a strain, and it was clear that the apartheid government cannot sustain that. But the sixth and critical factor was inside South Africa itself, the ordinary people, the masses of the people had risen up against apartheid, and they were not going to be deterred by the biggest guns on the African continent at the time. So all those factors cumulatively, I think, but the credit for the Nationalist Party government at the time that I will give is that they read the writing on the wall correctly, because they realized that under these circumstances, it will not make sense.
They cannot survive.
They will not survive. Therefore, they will have to find a way in which they could go back to the original demands of the African National Congress and other
vote of the people.
Exactly. To say the only way in which we are going to resolve the problem of apartheid in South Africa is not and can never be through force of arms. It can never be by shedding blood, but it will have to be through a negotiated settlement peacefully so that we can live peacefully together.
I think by this very meaningful narrative, I think we end up this first part of our conversation, then we come back. أعزائي المشاهدين فاصل قصير ثم نعود، فابقوا معنا. مرحبا بكم مرة أخرى أعزائي المشاهدين، ونحن نواصل الحوار مع السيد السفير فرانسيس مولدي سفير جمهورية جنوب أفريقيا، ونحن نقلب صفحات التاريخ ونستعرض هذه السيرة الباذخة من سيرة زعيم الحرية نيلسون مانديلا في الذكرى المئوية لميلاده هذه الأيام. We end up at the first part, Mr. Ambassador, reviewing, the legacy, the living legacy of Nelson Mandela, but would like also to shed light about the truth and reconciliation. It is a very famous step marching toward a long walk to freedom, and it inspired conflict resolution in Africa. Sudan, one of the countries, received this legacy in a very good way because it resembles, tolerance, peaceful settlement, and confession about the oppression on the people. And people should forgive. Can you explain to us, from where did it come? How does it work during that time? And what is the end result? Did it heal the wound of the people?
Okay. Mr. Khalid, the background to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, during the negotiations for the democratic transition, one of the critical questions that was asked was, what are we going to do with the crimes that were committed under apartheid? Mm-hmm. Remember, the international community had declared apartheid a crime against humanity.
Yes.
And many people had died. Many people had been tortured. Many people were imprisoned for many years, and others were in prison without charges, without ever having been convicted of anything. Many people had disappeared, and some of them their bodies have not been discovered up until today. So the wounds and the pain of apartheid ran very deep in the minds of South Africans. So the question that was asked was, what is it that we are going to do with that? Are we simply now going to say we are going to talk and find a political settlement and brush off all that away without addressing it in some way or so? Because if we do that, we will be promoting the culture of impunity. And we will not be sensitive to the pain that is still going on, ravaging the hearts of many people. Because there were parents who were asking, what happened to my son? What happened to my daughter? And how are we going to address that? Okay? So the idea then came about that as part and parcel of the reconciliation process, we need to have a mechanism that will allow those people whose hearts are bleeding, allow them an opportunity to tell their story, because that is part of healing. When you can share your pain with the world, because you know what they say? They say pain shared is pain halved. Okay, so you allow those people to tell their story, and you also allow those people who were the perpetrators of the crimes against humanity to also tell their story and ask for forgiveness, because we are not going to prosecute them, but we will allow them an opportunity to also tell their story, because where you have a victim, you also have a perpetrator. And many of those people who perpetrated these crimes, they are also hurting, because you can't treat another human being that way and still think that your conscience will be clear. So the idea was the perpetrators must also be given an opportunity to tell their story, but to ask for forgiveness. And where the perpetrators are able to answer some of the questions of the victims, that must be done. But there was an incentive that was given to the perpetrators, that when you come forward and you apply for amnesty, you must tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And when you can do that, then you will be granted amnesty. In other words, you will not be prosecuted.
But do you mean that this is a good model for conflict resolution to pass through a difficult time in the nation's history?
Well, we as South Africans were not the first ones to come with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Some countries in Latin America had done the same. But obviously, all these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are very different.
This is a transitional justice.
Exactly. This is transitional justice. And as you know, Africans who are not known for retributive justice,
yes.
The kind of justice that we Africans aspire to and practice is restorative justice. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was also an attempt at that level, at that individual, personal level, to allow people to find peace in their hearts. Because it is easy for politicians, these are big people. Nelson Mandela there, F.W. de Klerk there, and all these big wigs, to simply sit down together, craft a deal, and there you have a political settlement. But you still leave the people behind, people who are still hurting. You asked me earlier whether or not that has succeeded and whether the wounds have been healed.
This is actually connected to my next question.
Oh yes.
So you can answer them together. I mean, this is maybe what do you call it? Maybe a difficult question, but I know that because we'd like to learn from this legacy of Nelson Mandela. Most of the analysts right now, they think that apartheid is over, definitely, but the fair and balanced kind of right still in South Africa is still questionable. Most of the people think that the black got the power and politics running the state business, but the economy still remain at the hand of the white people over there. Mm-hmm. As if that all this struggle, all these measures, all this mechanism cannot correct some mistakes of the history. What do you think?
I think you are correct, Mr. Khalid, that 1994 gave, shall we say, the black majority, gave them political power. But the economic power remained largely in the hands of white people. And up until today, you can still see that legacy there in South Africa, that the economy is still run largely by the white people. And that is why one of the key policies that the new government in 1994 put in place was to see how we can change all that. So there were a number of policies that were put in place largely to deal with affirmative action or black economic empowerment and programs like that, in order to open up the space in the economic life of South Africa for those who were previously excluded to participate. And that is why the government has put in place a number of programs. One of them would be the Black Industrialist Project. The state has put aside funds and programs that are aimed at assisting black industrialists. There are programs aimed at assisting black and emerging entrepreneurs. There are policies that require special types of procurement policies. If you are government, there are policies that say you should procure your goods and your services from those companies that are largely run by black and by women. So all those programs are aimed at facilitating a process where we could open, although it takes some time, we could open the avenues for people, those who were previously excluded, to participate in the economy. Because unless we do so, we will still remain with the legacy of poverty.
Yes,
will still remain, and when that happens, we shall not be eradicating those conditions that always give rise to strife.
Excellency, I mean, I would like just the last part of our discussion to focus on relation of South Africa and Sudan. I mean, Sudanese are proud that in 1962, Nelson Mandela visited Khartoum during Aboud time, and still room number 217 at Grand Holiday Villa, which Grand Hotel at that time, which built in 1902, that was the room of Nelson Mandela. People still, very fond of that history. And also, we got to know that, Nelson Mandela had been handed over a Sudanese passport at that time. This actually, a book documented the relation of and the visit of Nelson Mandela to Khartoum, which is edited by Dr. Umar al-Noor. That time, this is the full story of the visit of Nelson Mandela to Sudan. But we think since that time, Sudan also was one of the leading countries as Pan-Africanist and one of the supporters of liberation movement in Africa. And how do you think about the relation between South Africa and Sudan?
Well, first of all, Sudan has been very close to the heart of Mandela, and he writes about it in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
Yes.
Because you'll recall that when Mandela came to Sudan in 1962, he had in fact left South Africa without a passport.
Yes.
Because the apartheid government at the time could not give him a passport. And he came here and he was given the Sudanese passport, which he used to travel all over the world with dignity and garner support for the liberation struggle in South Africa. Yes. So in his entire life, Mandela has held the passports of only two countries, Sudan, the first one, and South Africa, the second one. So he is in fact very much a Sudanese as much as he is South African. And as I said, Sudan is very, very close to his heart. I mean, for us as South Africans, we always say that our freedom would not have come had it not been because of the support of our brothers and sisters on the African continent and the international community as a whole. And the role that Sudan in particular played in the liberation struggle, not only of South Africa, but of many countries in Southern Africa. I mentioned earlier that Sudan supported the liberation struggle of the people of Mozambique.
Correct.
Supported the liberation struggle of the people of Zimbabwe,
yes.
The liberation struggle of the people of Namibia and ourselves. And this was happening at a time when Sudan itself was emerging out of the shackles of colonialism.
We are 7 years independent.
Absolutely. But the government and the peoples of Sudan at the time did not say, oh, we have our own freedom and independence now. We
don't care about anybody.
Exactly. Look at all the challenges that we have in Sudan that we have to address. We had our own struggle here and want to focus on building and rebuilding Sudan. You continue to do what is good for Sudan, but you put your shoulder to the will of freedom of other countries. And that has been something that we cherish very closely as South Africans, and we continue to say we shall never be able to repay the debt that we owe to the people of Sudan for having supported our struggle. And talking about the South Africa-Sudan relations, I think the histories like that, the connection between the people of Sudan and the people of South Africa provide us a very solid basis to then sit back and say, now that we have these excellent political relations, how do we use them to ensure that we can benefit our people, rebuild our countries, and give our people opportunities through education, through training, through sharing experiences in various fields of agriculture, mining, and all this, because that way we shall be given meat, as it were, to the bare bones of our political relations. And in my 3.5 years that I have been here, I am pleased to see that there are very clear areas of cooperation that South Africa and Sudan can work in. In fact, I see that in the areas of agriculture, and I've visited Gadarif and I've seen the commercial agriculture that goes on there, is that there are many South African farmers who are working in Gadarif with Sudanese companies. And what I saw there blew my mind, and it just shows what is it that we can do as Sudan and South Africa in this area of agriculture. In the area of mining, you would know that our own economic development took place on the backdrop of mining, when we discovered the diamonds and gold. Now Sudan is rich in mineral resources.
I think South Africa and Sudan are the most dominant producer of gold right now in Africa.
Absolutely.
You are the first, Sudan is the second right now.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But in the case of Sudan, I think Sudan has not taken full advantage of the richness of its minerals.
Correct.
And this is where I think South Africa, with our technology, with our expertise, with our know-how, and sharing of experiences, because in the past 120 years of our mining, there are so many mistakes that we have committed in that process.
But I mean, the Sudanese people also appreciate, I mean, how South Africa was very helpful during the economic sanction from US, I mean, at that time. South Africa, part of the countries that try to reach out to Sudan and support Sudanese economy in different ways, you know. So I think there is great potential. This is in addition to our rich history together at that. But having this political strong connection and all this also a strong history together, I think our trade exchange is much lower than our expectation and aspiration.
Oh, absolutely.
So we need more to do in that field together.
In fact, if I may just come in there, Mr. Khalid, you know, when we shall be celebrating the centenary of Mandela on the 6th of December through that gala dinner, one of the things that we will do during that is to launch the South Africa-Sudan Business Council.
Oh, this is a good idea.
Yes, we have already had a preliminary seminar bringing together some of the leading business leaders here in Sudan and the leaders of South African companies doing business in Sudan and the South African business leaders working for Sudanese companies. We have been toying around with this idea that we need to create a vehicle that will provide a platform for business people on both sides to interact and to do business. So with the launch of the South Africa-Sudan Business Council, we have great hope that this will be the beginning of great things to come between South Africa and Sudan, given our excellent relations that we have.
This is really great, and also we are grateful that, you know, in the terms of peacemaking, I mean, former President Mbeki right now is involved in peacemaking in Sudan, heading the HUP under the AU high-level commission for that, and Sudanese people really having their mind that great love and good legacy for Nelson Mandela and also South Africa in general. And I think that peacemaking in Sudan under the leadership of President Mbeki it is still in the right track.
Yes. Can I just say something about that, Mr. Khalid? I think you are absolutely right. This is one area where South Africa and Sudan can work together and share ideas in the peaceful resolution of conflicts.
Yes.
But, you know, when I came here to Sudan in 2015, I arrived at a time when His Excellency President al-Bashir had launched this national dialogue here in Sudan. And for me, I thought I am going to have the second bite at the cherry because I have arrived in a country where the people of Sudan have decided that the challenges that they have been having all these years, they now want to sit down together and find a peaceful way of resolving that. And I always say, the decision to sit down together as Sudanese to find a peaceful way to all the challenges that you have is very powerful. It sends a very powerful message, not only to the people of Sudan, but to the countries in the region, to our own continent and the world at large. I know that not everything out of the national dialogue has been achieved, but the fact that the Sudanese people have committed themselves to find a peaceful solution to their problems is powerful. So Sudan and South Africa and Namibia and a host of other countries on the African continent who have found a solution to their problems through dialogue, it's a very powerful message that we as Africans are sending to the world. And I say about the national dialogue of Sudan, maybe in the future there will be other countries that will be faced with the kind of political challenges that require some solution. And those countries and those people will look to countries that have gone and walked that route. And Sudan will be one of those countries that will be consulted and in order to share experience, because the peaceful dialogue processes that all of us have embarked upon are different and they are very unique. South Africa will bring its own unique contribution, which may not be replicated in other countries, but there will be particular aspects that are taken there. So Sudan has joined that avalanche of peacemakers. And as I say, I have no doubt that Sudan will be one of the key countries that will provide leadership on this very important issue of finding solutions
maybe
to
just
peace.
Last question, very briefly. I mean, the legacy of Mandela can allow him to be president for life. But one of the great legacies that, he decided just to leave presidency, to renew the leadership, and to establish deep democracy and constructive democracy. Why Nelson Mandela refused to be president for life?
Oh yeah, well, many people say he could have, but I think initially Nelson Mandela was not quite keen to even be president, even for one term. He was not keen. When he was asked that he will be president, he complained. He said, look at me, I'm an old man. I was in prison for 27 years. What do I know about the world? What do I know about running a country? There are young people, men and women here in South Africa who can provide leadership to this guy. Why do you ask me? Okay? But the people demanded and wanted him to be president. But one of the conditions he gave is that, okay, I will agree to be president, but if you also agree that I will be president for only one term, because I think he understood that.
That's a great message, actually.
Oh, it's a very powerful message.
It's a very powerful message. I mean, Mr. Ambassador Francis Molloy, unfortunately, our time is over. Okay. I was really enjoying this conversation about the great legacy of our leaders and African leaders. Nelson Mandela celebrating It's a century of his birthday, and definitely Sudanese people has great respect, love for this icon in human history and African history as a freedom fighter, as a leader for new horizon in our history regarding peace, tolerance, and freedom. Thank you very much for your time with us, and hope that the celebration will be a landmark in our bilateral history between South Africa and Sudan. أعزائي المشاهدين، في الختام لا يسعنا إلا أن نتقدم لكم بفوافر الشكر والتقدير على حسن الاهتمام والمتابعة، ونحن كما ذكرنا من قبل نقلب صفحات هذا التاريخ الناصع لأحد عظماء الإنسانية ذي الملامح الأفريقية الذي حقق ما عجزت عنه قوى السلاح والحرب والقمع والإكراه والجبر، فأن يجعل شعب جنوب أفريقيا تحت الاضطهاد، لكنه قاد شعلة الحرية وحرر ليس فقط جنوب أفريقيا لكن الإنسانية جمعاء من أن ترزح تحت القهر والاضطهاد. إنه بؤرة الأمل الذي نحتفل بعيد ميلاده 100 هذه السنة. لكم الشكر والتقدير. تقبلوا تحيات خالد موسى وتحيات الفريق العامل، وإلى اللقاء في حلقة أخرى. Thank you very much, Mr. Malloy.
Thank you so much.
It's great. Thank you very much.